Amid the extravagant dinner, a shrill scream tore through the luxurious atmosphere. "Don't eat that!" A young black boy rushed forward and knocked the plate of food out of the billionaire's hand. Outrage erupted, and scornful glances turned toward the boy, but just seconds later everyone was stunned. The food had been poisoned, and the scariest part? The mastermind could be sitting right inside the restaurant, watching it all with a cold smile. Located in the heart of the city, Park Avenue Café is a hidden gem among the luxurious district, a place where only the elite are allowed. But inside, amid the tailored suits and expensive dishes, there exists another world. The world of power, money, and conversations that could change the dynamics of an entire market. At the center of it all, at the finest table in the restaurant, Richard Calloway, one of the wealthiest real estate moguls in America, sat across from his much younger wife, Vanessa Calloway, who was nearly 30 years his junior. At 72, Richard still maintained the dignified air of a businessman who had once controlled billion-dollar deals. His sharp eyes were tinged with a trace of weariness. His graying hair was neatly combed, the perfectly tailored suit fitted him impeccably, and a Rolex glistened on his wrist, all signs of power and wealth. Vanessa, in stark contrast to her older husband, was the epitome of flawless beauty. Her porcelain skin was unblemished, her black hair flowed effortlessly to her shoulders, and her deep red lips were sharp and enticing. She looked like a model straight off the cover of a high-fashion magazine. On her wrist was a sparkling diamond bracelet, which she absent-mindedly twirled while her eyes remained fixed on her phone screen. The couple's lunch proceeded in heavy silence. Richard watched Vanessa through his gold-rimmed glasses, his eyes etched with deep thought. What is she thinking? He wondered. Despite being married for 7 years, he had never truly understood this woman. Vanessa suddenly looked up and caught her husband's gaze, flashing a perfect but cold smile before returning her focus to her phone. Richard sighed. He wasn't young anymore, and perhaps Vanessa knew that better than anyone. Just outside the cafe, Jayden Carter stood leaning against a streetlight, his backpack slung over his shoulder, patiently waiting for the bus after school. He was only 14, but his tall frame made him appear older than his years, with broad shoulders and sharp eyes, the hallmark of someone raised with strict discipline. His father, Colonel Marcus Carter, a Navy SEAL team leader, was a stern yet fair man who had always taught his son about responsibility, honor, and courage. His white school uniform shirt was perfectly pressed, and his striped blue tie was neatly tied. He could have looked like any other high school student, but deep down, Jayden was no ordinary child. He stood there, eyes scanning everyone inside the cafe. It was an unconscious habit he learned from his father, observing and assessing his surroundings. A fleeting moment, but Jayden had no idea that in just a few seconds, his life would take a completely different turn. Jayden stood there, his hands still gripping the straps of his backpack. His eyes focused on the people inside the cafe through the large, clear glass window. The sunlight reflected off the glass surface, casting a delicate, translucent shadow, but it couldn't conceal the unsettling scene inside. It was just a fleeting moment, but enough for him to realize something was wrong. Vanessa Calloway, the woman who still maintained an elegant, graceful appearance in her deep red silk dress, subtly leaned toward Richard. Her movement was smooth, natural, but as Jayden's gaze sharpened, he noticed something odd. She didn't reach for her husband in a familiar, intimate gesture. Instead, her long fingers silently slid into the designer handbag placed on the chair beside her. Jayden narrowed his eyes. In the blink of an eye, Vanessa pulled out a small, clear bottle containing a colorless liquid. The motion was swift, fluid, like she had done this countless times before. Her fingers twisted the cap off the bottle, and with unnerving precision she poured the liquid into Richard's soup. The silver spoon in Richard's hand hadn't yet touched his lips, but in just 1 second it would. Jayden froze. He could feel every beat of his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, a tense, horrific sensation creeping through his veins. His father, Colonel Marcus Carter, a man who had faced hundreds of military campaigns and stood at the edge of life and death, had taught Jayden from a young age. When you see something wrong, you have a responsibility to speak up. Doing nothing is a choice, but it is always the worst one. But this wasn't school bullying. It wasn't cheating on a test. It wasn't someone forgetting to pay at the store. This was murder. Jayden swallowed hard, his hands gripping so tightly that his knuckles turned white. What should he do? Inside the cafe, Vanessa still wore the perfect smile on her face. No one, not a single person in the cafe, noticed what she had just done. The customers continued chatting cheerfully. The servers walked back and forth with trays of food, and no one saw the death that had just been dropped into Richard Calloway's soup. Only Jayden saw it all. He had no proof, he wasn't an adult, he had no reason to intervene, but Richard Calloway was lifting the spoon. Jayden felt like time had frozen. Every movement Richard made, from stirring the spoon in the soup, to bringing it to his lips, to blowing on it lightly, played in Jayden's mind like a slow-motion film. Just 1 more second, and no! Jayden rushed toward the cafe door, his arm shooting out instinctively, his heart pounding wildly. His mouth opened before his mind had a chance to think. Don't eat that! The entire cafe suddenly fell silent. The atmosphere in the cafe seemed to be ripped apart by Jayden's sudden scream. In an instant, all sounds seemed to be drained away, the joyful chatter, the clinking of silverware against china. The flipping of menus fell silent, as if the entire cafe had been frozen in a single moment. All eyes turned to the 14-year-old boy standing frozen in the doorway, his breath coming in quick gasps, his hands clenched tightly, his eyes wide with panic but determined. He couldn't stand still and watch someone about to be harmed without doing anything. In the center of the cafe, Richard Calloway was frozen, his silver spoon hovering in the air, just inches from his lips. Vanessa Calloway suddenly froze. The expression on her flawless face changed frighteningly, from surprise to discomfort, then to a brief, calculating glint in her eyes. It wasn't anger nor panic, but a flash of cold calculation. She slowly set her glass of wine down on the table, tilting her head as she looked at Jayden as if he were an insect who had just ruined her meal. What the hell do you think you're doing? Vanessa's voice was icy, though a hint of hidden agitation showed behind the sharpness of each word she spoke. Jayden swallowed hard, but didn't back down. He can't eat that. His voice shook slightly, but it was clear. I saw you put something in his soup. Whispers began to spread through the cafe like a small wave growing bigger. The customers, initially just curious about a schoolboy suddenly shouting in a fancy restaurant, began to look at each other with suspicion. Richard blinked, confusion evident on his face. What are you talking about? Put what in the soup? Vanessa blinked, then suddenly burst into a short, sharp laugh, cold and somewhat mocking. How absurd! She shook her head slightly, her eyes turning toward the guests, whispering, This boy doesn't even know us. Richard, are you really going to let some street kid ruin your meal? A blow to his honor, a clever move. Jayden felt his chest tighten. He wasn't a street kid. His father was a Navy SEAL captain, taught to uphold honor and courage, but to a stranger in a high-class restaurant he was just some lost kid, a troublemaker for no reason. But no, he couldn't let that stop him. I'm not a street kid, Jayden said clearly, dismissing the doubt in Vanessa's voice. And I saw you do it. I saw you take out a small bottle. I saw you pour something into that bowl of soup." A few guests gasped in shock. Richard set the spoon down. He tilted his head, looking at Vanessa with a completely different expression. Not the admiration of a husband, but the assessing gaze of a man who had lived and knew when someone was lying. "Vanessa," his voice was low now, no longer soft. "What's this boy talking about?" Vanessa felt the pressure building on her. She knew this was the pivotal moment. She had to either maintain control or be drowned. "Richard, are you serious?" Her voice held a touch of indignation, as if the mere thought of being accused was a terrible insult. "You really think your wife, could do something like that?" A familiar tactic. A beautiful, high-status woman, perfect in appearance, couldn't possibly be the villain, right? But Vanessa didn't realize one thing. Richard Calloway wasn't a fool. The atmosphere in the cafe was as tense as a drawn bowstring. Jayden stood still, his hands clenched, his gaze unwavering. He didn't know whether Richard would believe him, but he knew he couldn't back down now. Richard gently bit his lower lip, then reached for the bowl of soup again, but this time he didn't intend to eat it. He lifted the bowl, bringing it closer to his nose. Vanessa froze involuntarily. Just that brief moment, but Jayden saw it. And more importantly, Richard saw it too. "Why are you so tense, Vanessa?" Richard asked, his voice low, slow, full of suspicion. She blinked, then forced a smile. "I just think this is all so ridiculous. A random kid bursts in here and says I'm trying to kill you? Who wouldn't find that absurd?" But there was something else in her voice, a tension that only someone perceptive would notice. Richard placed the soup bowl down on the table, no longer intending to taste it. The cafe remained silent, but now it was no longer the silence of shock, it was the silence of doubt. Vanessa Calloway, the beautiful wife of a powerful billionaire, was she hiding a deadly secret? Jayden swallowed hard. He had accomplished something important. He stopped Richard from eating that soup, but this battle was far from over. Jayden took a deep breath, feeling the atmosphere in the cafe shift entirely. At first, there was just astonishment and curiosity when a young boy suddenly stormed in and shouted, but now doubt had crept into every glance. People no longer focused solely on him, but instead began watching Vanessa, waiting for her reaction. But Jayden didn't care about the others. He locked eyes with Richard, the man who had set his spoon down and had no intention of eating anymore. He couldn't take back his words, couldn't turn back now. If he stayed silent, if he chose the safe path and let it go, this man could be dead within minutes. "I saw her put something in his soup," Jayden repeated, this time clearer, stronger. Richard squinted, his sharp brown eyes staring at his wife. His facial features tightened, as though evaluating a risky investment he wasn't sure he should make. He wasn't a fool. He knew the power and how people manipulated the truth. "Is that true, Vanessa?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Vanessa threw her head back and chuckled softly, a sarcastic laugh. How ridiculous. She shook her head, casting a quick glance at the customers who were quietly watching. "A high school kid thinks he can accuse me." But even though she was laughing, her eyes were no longer natural. Something had shifted. Just a hint of awkwardness, a flicker of tension, a moment of hesitation that someone sharp like Richard wouldn't miss. Richard crossed his arms in front of his chest, an unconscious gesture he always made when he felt someone was lying. "This boy seems very certain." Vanessa let out a cold laugh, but this time there was a trace of irritation in her tone. "Certain? Richard, Are you seriously listening to a kid talk like he's a real detective? She turned to Jayden, her gaze cold. Kid? Do you even know who I am? Jayden swallowed, but didn't lower his gaze. I don't care who you are. I only care about what I saw. His calmness caused Vanessa to freeze for a moment. She didn't expect a 14-year-old to be unafraid of her. Part of her wanted to push him away, to shout and crush that courage, but she knew that would only make her look even more suspicious. A smart villain never loses control. Vanessa adjusted her demeanor, loosening her shoulders as though it was all just a silly game. Oh, really, kid? So what do you think I put in there? Jayden hesitated. He didn't know. He didn't know what kind of poison it was. Didn't know if it had a smell. Didn't have any scientific proof that the soup had been laced with poison. He only had himself, his own eyes that saw the act. But Vanessa had caught on to this opening. You don't know, do you? She continued, her tone softer, as though trying to soothe a child who had made a mistake. You just saw me do something, and now you think you know everything? A few light laughs sounded from the surrounding tables. Some people started to waver. Jayden felt a weight in his chest. She was turning the tables. But before he could respond, Richard suddenly interrupted. Vanessa. His voice was colder than before. You seem very good at dodging the issue. I'll ask again. Did you or did you not put something in my soup? Vanessa was momentarily startled. Her fingers instinctively clenched into a fist. A tiny reaction, almost unnoticeable, but for someone like Richard who was used to business, he noticed it immediately. Just a second of hesitation and he knew something was wrong. Vanessa turned her gaze to a nearby server and waved them over. I've said too much. Her voice was sharper now. Bring me a new bowl of soup, this one's cold. A diversion. But Richard wasn't a fool. He knew exactly how criminals reacted when cornered. Jayden clenched his fists. Vanessa might be trying to shift the attention, but he wouldn't let this go silent. If you didn't do anything wrong, then eat the soup. His words rang out clear as thunder in the still air. The café fell silent. All eyes were on Vanessa. Richard squinted. Vanessa hesitated for a moment, then laughed, a soft laugh, but there was no joy in it. How childish. But she didn't touch the soup, and that was all Richard needed to see. The café remained in deadly silence. The psychological battle had begun. The atmosphere in the café was suffocating with tension. All eyes were still on Richard Calloway's table, where the bowl of soup remained, steam rising from it. Yet no one dared to touch it. Jayden, despite his heart pounding in his chest, remained firm. He had spoken the truth, and now he would not let it be suffocated just because someone more powerful was trying to control the situation. He took a deep breath, keeping his eyes fixed on Vanessa. If you have nothing to hide, let someone check that bowl of soup. A simple sentence, yet it felt like a sharp blade slicing through the tense air. Vanessa clenched her hands, her cold eyes flashing with a hint of impatience. She knew that the longer this dragged on, the more risk there was of being exposed. But a panicked or angry reaction now would only make her seem more suspicious. She furrowed her brow, crossing her arms over her chest, trying to regain her usual confidence. You have no proof. Who would believe a street kid over me? The café fell silent for a moment, as if Vanessa's words pulled everyone back into the harsh reality of class discrimination. Jayden was not a street kid, but in the eyes of the rich people sitting here, he was not part of their world. He swallowed his anger, but did not let himself be swayed. I don't need to be anyone. I just need to be the one who saw you do it." Richard placed his spoon down, his sharp gaze still fixed, but now filled with doubt. Even as a seasoned businessman, accustomed to being exploited for money, he had never faced a situation like this. A strange schoolboy with nothing to lose, daring to stand up against his wife in front of dozens of people. He scrutinized Vanessa carefully for the first time, looking at her as a stranger. "Vanessa," he said, his voice slow but heavy with weight, "can you explain why this boy is saying such things?" Vanessa laughed. A short laugh, but more forced than before. "Richard, I really can't believe you're doubting me because of a child's words." But her hand, though she tried to remain calm, still gripped the armrest of her chair instinctively. A small sign of worry, but enough for the most perceptive to notice. The guests began to murmur, voices rising from all corners of the café. Why won't she just let them check the soup? If she really is innocent, what's the reason for this tension? A middle-aged woman, draped in a luxurious fur coat, whispered to the man beside her, "She really looks scared." Vanessa felt the anger rise in her chest. She tried to regain control, but everything was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't let it go on any longer. She stood up from her chair, placing both hands on the table, her eyes sharp as knives locking onto Jayden. "I've been patient with you long enough." Her voice was sharp, cold, full of authority. "Do you really think you can barge in here, make up a ridiculous story, and get everyone to believe you? Do you even know who you're talking to?" A classic power play, crushing the opponent with status and mental domination. But Jayden didn't back down. He kept his gaze steady, maintaining his position. "I'm not making things up." His voice was firm, without any sign of wavering. "You know that, and he's starting to doubt it too." He glanced at Richard, seeing him observing his wife in an entirely different way. Vanessa saw it too. She could feel Richard's trust beginning to waver. She knew that if this continued, the truth would be exposed. Number. She couldn't let that happen. She exhaled sharply, then suddenly laughed in a mocking way, shaking her head as if she had just heard something ridiculous. How pathetic. Vanessa turned to Richard, her eyes narrowing with a pitying look. "Are you really going to let some strange kid question the wife who has been by your side all these years?" A blow to the emotions. A final attempt to manipulate the truth. But Richard didn't respond immediately. He looked at the bowl of soup, then at Vanessa. His silence was heavy, like a verdict. Jayden felt it. Richard was standing at a crossroads. Either he believed his wife, or he believed the truth that he was starting to sense. He only had one chance left. He had to make Richard see what he hadn't dared to admit. Jayden took a deep breath, and then said one last thing. Enough to change everything. "If you really trust her, then let her taste that soup." This time, Vanessa couldn't laugh anymore. The atmosphere in the cafe became so suffocating that it seemed as though everyone was holding their breath. The bowl of soup now was no longer just a regular dish, but had become the focal point of suspicion. A crucial piece of evidence in a tense battle of wits. Vanessa maintained her confident exterior, but anyone paying attention could see the tension spreading through her every movement. And then the cafe door swung open. 2 police officers in dark uniforms walked in. They were not in a hurry, not causing a commotion, but their presence was enough to silence the entire room. Vanessa turned pale. One of the officers, a tall man with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward, scanning the crowd before speaking. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but it carried authority. Jayden didn't hesitate. He took a step forward, pointing directly at the soup bowl on Richard's table. I saw her put something in this soup. If it's poisoned, it will kill him." Whispers erupted louder. People began murmuring, exchanging skeptical glances, while Vanessa sat there, her hands clutching the arms of her chair, but her face still trying to remain composed. Richard looked at Jayden, then at the police. For a moment, he said nothing, but his gaze was thoughtful, as if rearranging the clues in his mind. After a tense silence, he nodded slowly. "Check it." Richard's words were like a gunshot. As soon as the words left his mouth, Vanessa jumped up, her chair sliding sharply backward with a screech across the cafe's marble floor. "Don't touch it," she almost yelled, her voice no longer smooth or dignified. But she had lost control. All eyes turned toward her, and despite her efforts to maintain composure, Vanessa realized she had made a grave mistake. An innocent person would have no reason to panic when the police checked their food. She realized this and tried to correct herself immediately. "I mean..." Her voice dropped, trying to regain her usual composure. "This is a private matter. I don't need to endure this humiliation." But the police were not easily manipulated. The tall officer stared at Vanessa intently, his eyes full of judgment. He had seen too many cases like this before. Criminals always tried to maintain a calm exterior, but when pushed, they couldn't hide their true nature. He glanced at his colleague, gave a signal, and then moved toward Richard's table. "We need to take this soup for testing." A waiter quickly brought over a sealable bag, ready for the police to seize the evidence. Vanessa clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, but she couldn't do anything. A cold sense of helplessness crawled down her spine. For the first time that day, she felt like she could lose. Jayden kept his eyes fixed on Vanessa, observing every subtle shift in her demeanor. His father, Colonel Marcus Carter, had once taught him, "When you see an animal cornered, you'll see its true nature." And right now, Vanessa was in the darkest corner of herself. She couldn't run, couldn't deny, couldn't manipulate anyone else. But Jayden also knew that someone like her wouldn't give up easily, and he was right. Vanessa bit her lip, her eyes scanning the room. She needed an escape. And then, an idea flashed in her mind. A final strike, a desperate attempt to turn the tables. She suddenly turned toward Jayden, her eyes filled with deep hatred. Why does everyone believe a kid, someone with nothing but baseless words? He could be a fraud, a troublemaker trying to cause a scene for money. Whispers erupted again. Some people began to waver, but Jayden remained unwavering. He looked Vanessa square in the eye, his voice calm but heavy with weight. "If you think I'm lying, then try the soup yourself." No one in the cafe spoke a word. All eyes were on Vanessa, waiting for her response, and this time she could come up with no excuse. The silence dragged on for too long. Vanessa swallowed hard, but didn't touch the spoon in front of her. And that was the answer everyone needed. Richard took a deep breath and slowly stood up from his chair. For the first time in their entire marriage, he looked at Vanessa not with the eyes of a husband, but with the eyes of a man who had seen too many lies in the business world. "Vanessa," his voice no longer held any tenderness. "You've just confessed." The officer nearby pulled out handcuffs, his gaze stern. "Vanessa Calloway, you're under arrest for suspicion of attempted poisoning." Vanessa froze. No, I didn't do anything. I'm innocent." She stepped back, her eyes wide with panic. But this time, no one believed her. The pretense had completely crumbled. The silence that had enveloped the coffee shop was shattered by the scream of Vanessa Calloway. No longer the elegant, graceful woman in a luxurious red silk dress, she now appeared like a cornered animal. her anger and panic blending in every word she uttered. All eyes were fixed on her, but Vanessa seemed oblivious. She had completely lost control. A police officer carefully picked up the bowl of soup, placing it in a sealed bag to be sent for testing. But just then, Vanessa suddenly jumped up, slammed her hand onto the table, her face flushed, her eyes burning with a rage long suppressed. "All right, I did it. I can't take it anymore. He should have died a long time ago." The coffee shop seemed to explode in astonishment. Some customers gasped, others covered their mouths as if unable to believe their ears. Whispers erupted like waves, but they were drowned out by the air filled with terror. Richard Calloway, the wealthy, powerful man who had weathered decades of business storms, could now only sit frozen, staring at the woman he once loved. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Vanessa's breath came in short gasps, her chest heaving violently. She felt everything crashing down. There was nothing left to hide. She smiled bitterly, but there was no joy in her smile, only despair and hatred. She stared at Richard, her eyes full of contempt. "Do you know how long I've put up with you, Richard?" she said, her voice now devoid of restraint. "For all these years, I had to play the role of a gentle, kind wife, while in reality I was just a bird trapped in your golden cage." Richard felt his heart squeeze. "Vanessa," his voice cracked, the hurt evident in his eyes. "You really wanted to kill me?" Vanessa laughed loudly, but the sound was more that of a madwoman than an elegant lady. "Not just wanted. I've been planning it for a long time," she spat, her voice dripping with hatred. "Do you know, Richard? I got tired of watching you sit on your massive pile of wealth, controlling everything, treating me like a decoration. I waited. I was patient. I pretended to be the perfect wife, but you just wouldn't die." The police stood motionless, as though they too were caught up in an unbelievable story. Jayden clenched his fists, unable to believe Vanessa's cold-bloodedness. She showed no remorse, no guilt, even blaming the very man she had intended to kill. But what shocked him even more was the way Richard remained seated, his eyes fixed on his young wife. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't anger, it was pain. The pain of a man realizing that the wife he had loved for all these years had never truly loved him. Vanessa tossed her hair back, looking as though she had finally released the weight that had burdened her for so long. "Well, now you all know," she said loudly, turning to the crowd with a bitter, provocative smile. "Look at this. Look at how foolish the man you've all admired for so many years truly is. He didn't even realize his wife wanted to kill him." A deadly silence fell over the room. No one said a word. No one moved. Vanessa held her head high, as if she were the victor in this battle. But then, a voice cut through the air, pulling everyone back to reality. "Vanessa Calloway, you are under arrest for attempted murder." The officer pulled out handcuffs and moved toward her. This time, the smile on Vanessa's face vanished. "No!" she screamed, stepping back. "I can't be arrested. I can't." But the police officer ignored her desperate cry. Jayden stood still, watching everything unfold before him. He knew he had done the right thing. He had stopped a murder, but he also knew that there were wounds that would never heal, and Richard Calloway would be the one to carry that wound for the rest of his life. The cold, metallic sound echoed as the handcuffs tightened around Vanessa Calloway's wrists, but she did not accept her fate easily. The elegant, refined persona she had carefully maintained for years was now just a torn shell, revealing the true nature of someone struggling in desperation. She thrashed, her eyes bloodshot, her body trembling, whether from rage or fear, as she realized everything had come to an end. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice hoarse, her chest heaving as if she were about to explode. "I can't be arrested. You can't do this to me. I was supposed to have it all. This world is supposed to be mine." Her words echoed throughout the luxurious room, but no one in the café paid any more attention to her insane declarations. Some guests gasped in shock. Others instinctively stepped back, as if they feared witnessing something too terrifying, something they had never imagined when they walked in to enjoy an expensive lunch. Curious eyes, murmurs grew quieter, then disappeared entirely as they all realized that Vanessa Calloway, the woman once admired by so many, the one who appeared on magazine covers with the image of a sophisticated, graceful lady, was now nothing more than a criminal clinging to the last shred of power before being dragged away. At the center of it all, Richard Calloway sank into his chair, his body feeling as though it had been crushed by a massive stone. His trembling hands rested on the table to maintain balance. He said nothing, showed no reaction, just sat there, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point, as if searching for some truth amidst the shattered remains of a completely destroyed marriage. Everything in his mind blurred. Images of Vanessa over the years passed by like a slow-motion film. Sweet words, gentle smiles, hugs, romantic evenings over wine, all tarnished by a horrific truth. She had never loved him. She had never cared for him. The only thing she craved was power, money, control. And when she could no longer control him when he grew older, when he started questioning their relationship, she decided he should die. The pain didn't come from the betrayal. The pain came from not realizing it sooner. A man who had spent his life standing atop wealth and power, who built an empire from scratch, had allowed his wife, sleeping beside him for 7 years, to deceive him like a fool. Jayden stood still, silently observing it all. He said nothing, didn't approach, didn't do anything to draw attention. But inside him, a strange sensation rose. Not satisfaction from exposing a villain, not pride from doing the right thing, but a heavy feeling, a strange emptiness. He had saved Richard's life, but at the same time he had witnessed a person completely collapse. His eyes looked at Richard, seeing him sitting there as someone who had lost everything, and in that moment Jayden understood that there were wounds that could never heal. The police began to escort Vanessa out, but she still didn't stop. She gritted her teeth, her eyes darkened with hatred, but deep down, a fear she couldn't conceal was apparent. For the first time in her life, Vanessa Calloway was no longer in control of anything. "Richard, do you really think you'll get away from me that easily? You think it's over here?" Her voice was cold, but tinged with a hint of trembling. Richard slowly looked up, his eyes empty as he gazed at her, as if he were looking at a complete stranger. He didn't answer. But Vanessa didn't stop. She screamed, struggled, her eyes blazing as though she wanted to pierce through the walls of people standing around her. "You'll regret not dying, Richard. You'll regret trusting that kid. Everything could have ended well if not for him." Jayden still said nothing, but he could feel the sharp edge of hatred directed toward him. He knew that, if given the chance, Vanessa wouldn't hesitate to do the same to him or anyone else in her way. But this time, she had no more chances. The police pushed her out of the café, the door slammed shut behind them, and silence enveloped the room. A soft breeze swept through, carrying a bit of dust from the cobblestone street outside, as if sweeping away the remnants of a story full of lies, betrayal, and ambition. Jayden looked at Richard, still sitting there, motionless. Perhaps in this moment he was wondering if there was anything real in life, or if it was all just a string of lies woven into a lavish carpet covering the emptiness beneath. But then, very slowly, Richard turned to look at Jayden. His gaze was no longer confused, no longer angry. It had softened, a little gratitude, a little contemplation, and a little exhaustion to the very core. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse, as if every word carried the weight of many years of deceit. Jayden swallowed, unsure of what to say. He didn't do it for thanks. He didn't do it for recognition. But he knew that, no matter how empty Richard might feel today, no matter how long the pain would last, at least he was still alive. And perhaps, from this moment on, Richard Calloway would never view the world the same way again. The atmosphere in the café still carried an invisible heaviness, even though everything had come to an end. Vanessa Calloway had been arrested, but the aftershock she left behind still lingered in the air. The whispers of the guests gradually grew quieter. Some had stood up and left, but the glances still kept flicking toward the elderly man sitting pensively at the table, untouched by his meal, and the young black teenager standing opposite him, who had changed the fate of everyone present today. Richard Calloway remained frozen, his whole body locked in a state of shock and exhaustion. The expensive Rolex watch on his wrist continued to tick, but he felt as though he had lost all sense of time. Throughout his life, he had dealt with countless multi-million-dollar deals, faced the most cunning businessmen, but never had he felt so brutally and cruelly deceived. Before him, Jayden Carter still stood unmoving, not in a rush to leave, nor expecting anything from the powerful man. The 14-year-old boy, who just moments ago had been an ordinary student on his way home, was now standing before a billionaire whom he had just saved. Richard looked up at Jayden, his gaze sharper, no longer the lost look he had before, but one of assessment, of understanding that only those who had lived through much could possess. "Do you know what you just did?" His voice was low and steady, not the voice of someone weak, but that of a man who had just awoken from a 7-year-long stupor. Jayden lowered his head, not out of embarrassment, but because he didn't know how to answer correctly. He had never done anything in hopes of recognition. He simply saw the truth and could not look the other way. "I just did what was right." His voice was calm but resolute. Richard paused at that response. He had met many people in his life, those who only wanted to take advantage of him, those who wanted his attention, those who sought to manipulate him for personal gain. But this boy was unlike anyone he had ever met. A 14-year-old child with no power, no wealth, no reason to get involved in such a dangerous situation. Yet he chose to do what was right. Even though the price might be that no one would believe him, he might be looked down upon, or even face real danger if Vanessa hadn't been arrested. Richard sighed, but this time it wasn't out of fatigue, but out of a deep emotion. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked directly at Jayden with a gaze full of respect. "You have a strong heart. I owe you my life." Jayden faltered for a moment, his eyes widening slightly. He never thought someone like Richard Calloway would say something like that to him. He didn't need the man's gratitude. He didn't do this for any reward. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The words of someone like Richard Calloway weren't just empty words. Richard took a deep breath, then slowly straightened his back, his demeanor gradually returning to that of a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of the business world. His eyes still showed pain, but there was something in them that had changed. "Sit down, Jayden." Jayden blinked, hesitated for a moment, but then pulled out a chair and sat across from Richard. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt that this moment was important. Richard studied him for a long time, then placed his hands on the table, interlocking his fingers, his voice deep but firm. "Do you have parents?" Jayden nodded. "Yes, my father is Marcus Carter." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Colonel Marcus Carter?" Jayden nodded again. Richard was silent for a few seconds. He had heard of Marcus Carter before. One of the finest SEALs, known for his discipline, loyalty, and integrity. And now, he understood exactly why Marcus Carter's son had such a strong heart. Not surprising. Richard smiled faintly, though his gaze remained heavy with thought. "You're the son of a respectable man." Jayden didn't respond. He was proud of his father, but he also knew that his father wasn't the only reason he had chosen to act today. Richard continued to stare at him, as if contemplating something deeply. Then, very slowly, he spoke. "I want to help you, Jayden." Jayden blinked, surprised. "Help me?" Richard nodded, his voice unwavering. "You saved my life. No one can deny that. And I'm not the kind of person to forget a debt like this. I want to make sure you have a better future. Anything you need, scholarships, opportunities, connections, I can help you achieve it." Jayden didn't know how to respond. He hadn't expected this, but looking into Richard's eyes, he saw real sincerity. This wasn't a man trying to bribe him, nor was it an empty promise. This was a man who had witnessed something rare in his life, unconditional courage, and wanted to return it in the best way he could. Jayden thought about it for a long moment, then slowly replied, "I didn't do this to get anything in return." Richard smiled gently, as if he had anticipated this response, but then he nodded and said something Jayden would never forget. "That's exactly why I want to help you." Richard leaned slightly forward, his gaze still sharp but less tense. He had been through so many events in the past hour, from being a man who thought he was enjoying lunch with his beloved wife, to discovering that she had secretly planned to kill him, and then being saved by a completely unfamiliar boy. His life had always been a series of billion-dollar deals, constantly rising numbers on financial charts, but he had never encountered a debt as deeply meaningful as the one he owed to Jayden Carter. Jayden stared at him, still not fully understanding the significance of what was happening. He hadn't saved Richard to get something in return, and he certainly didn't think the man would actively offer to help him. But then, Richard pulled his phone from his suit pocket, his fingers swiftly gliding through the contacts, a familiar move of someone used to making major decisions without hesitation. He dialed a number, held the phone to his ear, all while still looking at Jayden with a thoughtful expression. "I have a student you should meet. This boy deserves the best future." Jayden widened his eyes in surprise. He didn't know who Richard was talking to, but just hearing his voice was enough for Jayden to realize that this wasn't an ordinary call. He sat up straight, his hands clenching together slightly. "What are you doing?" Richard smiled lightly, but there was no hint of mockery in the smile. "I'm giving you the opportunity you deserve." In the next few minutes, Richard spoke with a man on the phone, his voice calm yet clear, carrying the confidence of someone who could change another person's fate with the right decision. Jayden couldn't hear the entire conversation, but he caught familiar names. One of the most prestigious private schools in the city, a place he had never imagined he could step foot into. A place where only the wealthy, the ones with powerful families, could attend. And Richard Calloway was speaking to the principal of that school about him. When the call ended, Richard placed the phone on the table, clasped his hands in front of him, and looked at Jayden with a serious expression. "I've just ensured that you'll have a full scholarship at the most prestigious private school in the city. If you accept, in just a few weeks, you'll be stepping into an environment you might never have thought possible." Jayden couldn't hide his confusion. Why are you doing this? I don't need this." Richard nodded, as if he had anticipated this response. "You don't need it, but you deserve it." Jayden bit his lip, unaccustomed to accepting help from others. He had always stood on his own, always fought for everything he had, but this time he knew rejecting it would be a mistake. Richard saw the hesitation in his eyes. He had seen many people turn down opportunities out of fear because they didn't believe they deserved it. But Jayden wasn't like those people. He didn't refuse out of fear, but because he didn't want anyone to owe him anything. And that was exactly why Richard wanted to help him more. He tilted his head slightly, his voice low but firm. "Jayden, you've done the right thing. And sometimes when you do the right thing, the universe will repay you in ways you can't predict." The young man sat still, reflecting on those words. He hadn't expected anything when he decided to stop Richard from eating that bowl of soup. He hadn't expected recognition, hadn't expected help, hadn't expected any reward. But now he had a chance to change his future, a chance that if he refused, he might regret forever. I don't know what to say," Jayden finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. Richard smiled gently, but his gaze remained sincere. "Then don't say anything. Just take this opportunity." And then, slowly, Jayden nodded. Richard leaned back, exhaling a sigh of relief. He wasn't someone who often did things like this. He had spent his entire life building an empire, making money, buying things that others couldn't have, but this time, he knew he had done something more meaningful than any profit he had ever made. Because he wasn't just helping a boy. He was investing in someone who truly deserved a brighter future, and for the first time in many years, Richard Calloway felt that he had done the right thing. The city sky spread out under the quiet night, the yellowish streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk as Jayden strode down the familiar street leading home. He had walked this path thousands of times, but tonight, everything felt different. The air seemed to carry an invisible weight, not because of fear or tension, but because of a sense of change creeping into every step he took. Jayden took a deep breath as he stopped in front of the familiar door, the warmth spreading in his palm as he touched the doorknob, turned it gently, and pushed it open. Inside the neat little house, the warm light spread from the living room, where Colonel Marcus Carter was sitting in an armchair, eyes intently watching the news on the TV screen. The middle-aged man, with a strong frame, straight posture, and a military-style haircut, had a sharp gaze, always carrying the solemnity of soldiers who had spent many years in battle. As soon as he heard the door open, Marcus glanced up, his eyes briefly passing over with a familiar observation. Not suspicion, but assessment. Having been through dozens of dangerous operations, his first instinct when seeing his son walk through the door was to read something different in his face. Jayden placed his backpack down, standing in front of his father, unable to hide the thoughtful look in his eyes. "Dad, I need to talk to you," he said. Marcus turned off the TV, set the remote aside, and gave his full attention to his son. "What is it?" he asked. Jayden swallowed hard, then recounted the entire event from that day, from when he discovered Vanessa Calloway putting something into Richard's soup, the moment he shouted to stop him from eating it, the tense confrontation in the café, the police's arrival, Vanessa's shocking confession, to Richard's offer to help him secure a better future. He didn't leave out any details. Marcus listened without interrupting, but Jayden could see his father's muscles tense, his eyebrows furrowing with each detail of the story. When Jayden reached the part where he had to stand before dozens of wealthy people, enduring their skeptical gazes and facing Vanessa's manipulation, He saw his father's hands tighten on the armrest, his knuckles turning white. When Jayden finished his story, the room fell into silence for a long while. He didn't know how his father would react. Would he be angry? Would he scold him for putting himself in danger? But then, very slowly, Marcus nodded proudly. "Son," he said, his voice low yet powerful, carrying the weight of many years of battlefield experience. "You did something many adults wouldn't dare to do." Jayden blinked, surprised. Marcus stood up, walked over to his son and placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his gaze filled with sincerity. "I'm proud of you." Just 4 words, but to Jayden they meant more than any reward in the world. He felt a warmth fill his chest, not because he needed validation, but because the person he respected most also believed that he had done the right thing. Marcus walked over to the small liquor cabinet in the corner of the room, poured himself a glass of whiskey, but instead of drinking it immediately, he gently swirled it in his hand, his gaze distant. "Do you know why what you did today was so important?" he asked. Jayden thought for a moment, then shook his head. Marcus took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice tinged with a touch of nostalgia. "In the military, sometimes we don't get to choose when we face evil. It can come when we least expect it, and if we don't act immediately, the opportunity may be gone forever." He looked up at his son, his eyes sharp but filled with pride. "You didn't back down. You didn't let fear control you, and that's what makes the difference between an ordinary person and one who can change the world." Jayden felt the weight of every word his father spoke. He had once thought that shouting in the café today was just a natural reaction, an instinctive action without much thought. But hearing his father's words, he began to realize that not everyone would have acted as he did. There were many people in the café today, many who must have seen Vanessa do something suspicious, but no one spoke up. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to risk their peace to stand up for someone they didn't know. But Jayden did, and that's what made him different. Marcus looked at his son for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "So, what have you decided about Richard Calloway's offer?" Jayden pressed his lips together, his gaze wavering for a moment, but then he nodded with certainty. "I'll take the opportunity." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised. "Good." He nodded slowly, then added something that took Jayden by surprise. "But remember, no one gives you anything without a reason. If you accept it, make sure you use it to create real value, not just for yourself, but for others as well." Jayden felt those words sink deeply into his thoughts. He had been given an opportunity that very few people ever get, but what mattered more was what he would do with it. Outside the window, the city sky remained still. But for Jayden, tonight marked the beginning of a new journey, a journey he had never imagined. But he knew one thing for sure: he would not waste this opportunity. On the first day at St. James School, one of the most prestigious schools in the city, Jayden Carter felt that everything around him seemed strangely unfamiliar. From the cobblestone paths leading into the vast campus, the Gothic-style buildings with towering windows and ancient arches, to the meticulously trimmed green lawns, everything made him feel as if he were stepping into a completely different world. He had heard of St. James, a school famous for its students, all children of successful entrepreneurs, politicians, and wealthy elites. This place was nothing like the public school Jayden had attended. Here, the students moved with confidence, carrying designer bags, wearing luxury watches, and polished leather shoes. Jayden passed through the grand gate, feeling the curious gazes upon him. He knew that in their eyes, he wasn't like the rest of the students here, but he also knew he didn't need to be like them, because he had entered this place in a different way, not with wealth or family status, but with something that no one could buy: courage. When Jayden sat down in his first class, he could hear quiet whispers around him. A few students glanced at him, whispering to each other, not out of malice, but because his story had spread like wildfire. Everyone knew he was the boy who had saved billionaire Richard Calloway's life. Everyone knew he had stood up to expose an assassination plot right in the middle of an upscale café. And because of that, they didn't know where to place him in their world. Not a rich kid, not the child of a powerful figure, but not a regular student either. He was something different. Jayden could feel the invisible pressure weighing on him, but he didn't let it shake him. He recalled what his father had told him the night before. No one gives you anything without a reason. If you accept it, use it to create real value, not just for yourself, but for others. And he knew this was just the beginning. That afternoon, as Jayden sat alone eating in the expansive cafeteria with long tables and elegant chandeliers, a deep voice spoke from behind him. "You're the kid who saved Calloway, right?" Jayden looked up and saw a group of 3 boys standing in front of him. The one who had spoken was a tall boy with neatly trimmed blonde hair, a perfectly pressed uniform, but there was an arrogance in every movement. Jayden noticed the small pin on his chest, a symbol of student council members, those who often held unspoken power in this school. Jayden didn't respond immediately. He simply set his plate down and stared directly at the boy. "I'm not sure if that's a question," he replied calmly, but with no trace of weakness. The blonde boy squinted, then laughed, but it wasn't a cheerful laugh. "Who do you think you are? You think just because Calloway has your back, you can walk in here and be on equal footing with us?" Jayden felt a slight discomfort rise within him, but he didn't let it control him. "I didn't come here to be on equal footing with anyone," he replied slowly. "I came here to learn." The simple words, but they carried weight. One of the boys standing behind nudged the blonde, as if reminding him to back off, but he didn't retreat. "Listen, Carter." He lowered his voice, his gaze no longer just challenging, but tinged with jealousy. "You might have fooled Calloway, but you can't fool me. I can spot a schemer when I see one." Jayden didn't change his expression, but he knew what the boy was implying. Some people couldn't believe that anyone would do the right thing without expecting something in return. Some couldn't accept that a black boy not from the elite class could step into their world without scheming or using someone. Jayden looked at him for a long moment, then gently pushed his chair back, stood up. "If you want to think that, that's your problem, not mine." And with that, he walked away, not looking back. He didn't need to prove anything to those who couldn't see beyond their own selfishness. In the days that followed, Jayden gradually adapted to life at St. James. He learned how to ignore the prying eyes, how to focus on his goals without being affected by the gossip. Not everyone at school hated him. Some teachers admired him for his courage, some students were curious about his story, and some genuinely respected him for who he was, not because Richard Calloway had helped him. Still, Jayden understood that this was just the beginning of a long journey. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew he wouldn't stop. Because he wasn't just proving that courage could change a person's fate. He was proving that a person could change the world around them if they dared to stand up and never back down. After everything that had happened, Richard Calloway began to see the world through a completely different lens. For many years, he had believed that everything could be controlled through reason, money, and strategic planning. But the event at the Park Avenue Café shook those beliefs. In just a few hours, he nearly lost his life to the person he trusted most, and was saved by a stranger, a 14-year-old boy he had never met before. This made him question his entire life. He had lived for over 7 decades, building a real estate empire worth billions, owning skyscrapers, luxurious mansions, and expensive cars that ordinary people could only dream of. But in the end, what really mattered? All the power, money, and status he held in his hands could not protect him from the betrayal of the wife he once loved. Yet it was a 14-year-old boy, someone with nothing but courage, who did what no one else dared to do. People around Richard began to notice the change in him. Richard Calloway had been a tough, closed-off, and brutally practical man. In the business world, he was known as a cunning fox, always putting profit first and never letting emotions interfere. But after that horrifying event, he was no longer the same person. He started to take time to observe everything more slowly, to truly look at the people around him, instead of just judging them by the numbers in contracts or beneficial relationships. His employees also felt this change. Before, Calloway only cared about work performance, but now he began to pay attention to each person's personal story. He noticed one of his employees was working overtime to pay for his mother's medical bills, and instead of ignoring it as he had before, he quietly raised his salary. He started organizing meetings with his employees, not just to discuss business strategies but also to listen to their lives, something he had never done before. People started talking about his transformation, but no one truly understood what had affected Richard so deeply. Only he knew. Sometimes, it's the people you least expect who can change your life. 3 months after the cafe incident, Richard called an important meeting with the company's executives. The meeting room on the 50th floor of Calloway Tower was filled with curiosity and tension, as everyone knew that whenever Richard Calloway called an impromptu meeting, it was sure to bring about a major change in business strategy. When Richard entered the room, everyone fell silent, waiting. He sat at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the familiar faces of those who had helped him build this empire. "I've been thinking a lot recently," he began, his voice calm but authoritative, "and I've realized that it's time for us to change." The executives exchanged skeptical looks. Change? Richard Calloway had never been one to alter his way of doing things. He was a ruthless pragmatist, someone who believed in the power of the market and numbers, not in things like compassion. But this time, they realized he was serious. Richard took a deep breath and looked them in the eye. "I want to create a scholarship fund for talented students who can't afford it." The room fell into stunned silence. One of the executives cautiously spoke up, as if he feared he had misheard. "Mr. Calloway, are you talking about charity?" Richard smiled, but it wasn't his usual, cold, sharp smile. It was a genuine smile. "No, I'm not doing charity, I'm investing in the future." He placed a stack of documents on the table and pushed them toward the executives. "I want us to create opportunities for kids like Jayden Carter, kids who are talented, intelligent, and courageous but have no opportunities. I want to make sure they have a path to success, even if they're not born into wealthy families." The people in the room still didn't fully understand what was going on. They exchanged confused looks. This was not Richard Calloway's style. But then, Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "There was a boy who saved my life, and he did it without any personal gain." He turned to face his team, his sharp eyes looking directly at them. "I've spent my life doing business, building an empire, but I don't want to leave this world without leaving something truly meaningful behind. We can do more than just make money. We can change the lives of those who deserve it." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, they nodded. They no longer saw Richard Calloway as just a cold, ruthless billionaire. They saw a man who had truly changed. Richard Calloway was no longer the man he once was, but he knew his journey wasn't over. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't erase the betrayal of Vanessa or get back the lost years. But he could change the future. He could give people like Jayden a chance they never had before. And he knew that this was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Time has passed, but the story of Jayden Carter and Richard Calloway still echoes. It was not just an event that made headlines and quickly faded into oblivion. It became a symbol of courage, change, and things that few could have anticipated. Jayden, once an ordinary boy, now has the opportunity to study at one of the city's most prestigious schools. But more importantly, he proved one thing. Justice has no skin color. Courage has no rank. The scholarship fund Richard Calloway established after the shocking event was not just money given away casually. It became a revolutionary program. He didn't just help talented students like Jayden. He created opportunities for other children, those with potential but no means to chase their dreams. Children who were once considered outcasts, dismissed because of their backgrounds, could now enter a world they never thought they belonged to. But more important than the numbers or the scholarships given away was the change within Richard Calloway himself. The man, who once only believed in wealth, status, and power, now understood that there are things that cannot be bought, like kindness, integrity, and courage, and Jayden was the one who showed him that. One afternoon, in the highest office of Calloway Enterprises, Jayden was invited to meet Richard for the first time since he offered to help him. The room, located on the top floor of the skyscraper, had large glass windows overlooking the city. The clear sky reflected off the glass, creating a space that was both imposing and expansive. Richard sat behind his desk, but this time, he was no longer the cold, distant man he used to be. When he saw Jayden enter, he smiled warmly, a real smile, no calculation or hesitation in it. "Have you gotten used to the new school?" he asked, his tone calm. Jayden nodded. "At first, it felt strange, but now I've gotten used to it." Richard nodded, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You know, Jayden," he said, his voice lowering as if about to say something important. "You've done something I never thought possible. You've made me see the world differently." Jayden fell silent, unsure of what to say. "I've lived over 70 years, and I thought I knew everything about life. But it turns out I was wrong," Richard continued, his eyes looking out the window, watching the streets below. "I used to think power was the only thing that could change the world. But you've taught me a different lesson." He turned back to face Jayden. "Justice has no skin color. Courage has no rank." Jayden felt a chill run down his spine, because that was exactly what he had realized long ago. But he never expected someone like Richard Calloway, a powerful billionaire, to admit it so sincerely. "Thank you," Richard said slowly. "Not because you saved me, but because you reminded me of something I had forgotten long ago, that sometimes even a small act can save a life." After the meeting, Jayden left the building, stepping onto the street with a strange feeling in his heart. He hadn't just changed his own life, he had changed someone else's life. Someone who seemed to have everything, but lacked the most important thing: faith in the goodness of humanity. And he knew that no matter what the future held, no matter where he went, he would always remember this lesson. Because sometimes a small act, a moment of courage, can create changes no one could ever expect. The story of Jayden and Richard became a symbol. It is not remembered just because of the shocking assassination attempt, but because it proved that people can still trust one another, that sometimes it only takes one person to stand up, and the whole world can change. Jayden entered the world of the wealthy, but he didn't let that world define him. He was still Jayden Carter, a black boy from a middle-class family without a prestigious background, without the privileges other students in his prestigious school had. But he had courage, and that made everything change forever. Some stories end with a period, but some stories have only just begun. And the story of Jayden Carter, of courage and justice, of change and compassion, will continue to resonate, not just in his life, but in the lives of anyone willing to stand up for what is right. The story of Jayden Carter is not just about a boy saving a billionaire, but a symbol of courage, integrity, and an unyielding spirit against evil. It reminds us that sometimes, even a small action can create great change, that justice has no skin color, and courage has no rank. But more importantly, what would you do if you found yourself in Jayden's situation? Would you be willing to stand up for what's right, even knowing it might make you a target for doubt and threats? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know how you would act in a similar situation. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share this video with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next meaningful stories. Thank you for watching. Always believe in the power of courage and justice.